Well, hi, everybody. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. This is the first in our 2024 season of The Parent Venture, which are parent forums brought to you monthly, one in English, one in Spanish. They are initiatives of the Sequoia Healthcare District, but we are also supported by the Sequoia Union High School District, Redwood City School District, and this organization, The Parent Venture. Today's topic is helping your child build good habits. And we're delighted to have with us Dr. Eran Magen, who I will tell you a little bit about.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Some of you, like Charlene was saying, the recording is only for this square. And so if you're up for turning on your camera, it just helps to not be speaking into the void. But otherwise, if you're feeling shy today, that's okay. I also saw Kim from the UK mentioned joining. So hello from the UK, where it's even darker than here. I'm in Connecticut, where it's quickly getting dark. I'm going to talk for 20 to 30 minutes. Oh, hello, everybody. This is really nice. Thank you all. I'm going to talk for 20 to 30 minutes about building good habits, and then we'll open it up to discussion, questions, and answers. And I'm really hoping there will be a lot of interaction between people here because you all have things to say, because presumably you're all parents or at least interested in parenting. I'll put my email later, or maybe Bev will put my email right into the chat. I'm very happy to talk to people or correspond or whatever. I don't charge for this. If people have questions later on or want to set up a few minutes to talk, I'm very happy to do this. So just keep this in mind for later on. So let's talk about building good habits. And the first thing I want to say is good for you, just for being here, just for making time, right? This is not obvious. Parenting happens all the time, and it happens in addition to the rest of life. And it's very important to just take a moment or maybe an hour and pause and think about what our goals are and how is this going and what our plans are. And I think it's amazing that you took time to do this. Good for you, good for your kids. Hopefully you're going to be learning something here that'll be helpful for you. If you don't, tell me. If you do, tell me too, because I'm as susceptible to hearing good things as the next guy. So habits. The reason habits are so important in life is because they act as a huge force multiplier that happens in the background, right? When we have a habit of doing something, we don't need to think about it at all. It just happens. Like most of us have a habit of brushing our teeth when we wake up. We don't need to plan for it, think about it, put additional kind of willpower into it. It just happens by itself. And so if we also have a habit of doing homework, clearing the dishes, studying this particular thing we want, going out running at a particular hour, whatever it is, the habits just keep on happening without requiring additional control on our part. And the more they happen, the more likely they are to happen next time. And so if we are able to help our kids develop productive, helpful habits, we're just setting them up on a train toward a better life. And so, of course, we want to have better habits for our kids. Of course, we want to have better habits for ourselves too. And so here are some suggestions for how to do it well. I'm going to start, as I often do, with just the very bottom lines for those of you that just have 20 to 30 seconds of concentration in them today. And then after that, you can switch off or stay on and hear more of the details. But here are the bottom lines, the takeaways from today. First is that when you're trying to develop a new habit, the hardest part and the most important part is developing the habit of starting the behavior. Like if you're developing a habit of exercising, let's say you want to stretch every morning, right? It doesn't matter how much you stretch in the morning. It's just starting to stretch, doing this at a particular time in the morning is developing the habits. And then on that first step, you can start hanging more and more steps. But the thing that takes the most effort and requires the most attention on your part as a parent is getting into the habit of taking that first step. I'll talk about this more later, but this is a super important point because people tend to look way down the line and want to see the complete habit. But the most important part is the very first act. You want your kid to take the dog out every day after dinner. It's just about getting up from the dinner table and touching the leash. That's step one. And if you can get to that, you're well on your way to developing a new habit. The second point is that as you're asking or suggesting for your child to change his or her behavior, ideally you make the changes very small. Again, even though the temptation is to say we want a huge change, we want to see an hour of practicing piano every evening, we want to see all the dishes cleared perfectly, whatever it is. We have to think about it like starting at ground level and trying to climb up to 20 feet. And if we're using a ladder, we need a ladder where each rung is very, very easy to reach, right? Including that first one, which is the most important one, right? But even after that, they need to be very easy to reach. They can't be set very far apart. We can't go from 0 to a lot very quickly. That's where fail happens. So the steps need to be not too far apart. Lastly, the concept of alignment is really critical when you are either encouraging your child or supporting your child in developing habits. And there need to be two kinds of alignment that happen here. One is you and your child need to be very well aligned, right? If your child feels like you're part of his or her team and the things are happening because they're good for your kid is very likely to be on board. And I'll talk a little bit about how to set up this kind of alignment. The other thing is that whatever is the goal you're aiming for, and ideally this is a goal that your kid also agrees is an important goal, has to align with the plan of change that you're proposing. It needs to make sense to your kid that this behavior that you're starting to implement will help your kid reach that goal that your kid cares about, which is sometimes less obvious than it seems to us. Like it might be very clear to us why doing a certain thing will help the kid get to a certain point, but it might not be obvious at all to your kid. So that has to be aligned at all. Okay, that's about the bottom lines. I'm going to start with how to achieve alignment because it's such a critical point. So the very first thing is just how good is your relationship with your kid? So those of you that have attended any of my sessions know that I think about relationships as containing goodwill in them, sort of like a bank account contains money. So this is like a relational bank account. And the more goodwill your kid has toward you, the more likely your kid is to do all manner of things that involve trust and being honest with you and cooperating with you when you request certain things and forgive you when we make mistakes and so on. Everything becomes easier when the relationship is better. So even if you're trying to encourage or teach or get your kid to perform a certain behavior in order to develop a habit, your kid is so much more likely to cooperate when there's a lot of goodwill in their relationship. And this well needs to be dug well before you need it, right? You want to be adding goodwill to the relationship. And so you can make deposits of goodwill into a relationship and you can make withdrawals. You can take goodwill out of the relationship. The way you make deposits is by showing your kid that you care about your kid or that you respect your kid in ways that make sense to your kid, in ways that your kid understands, reflect those things. And then the way that you make withdrawals is essentially the opposite. When you show your kid that you don't really care, that your kid's enjoyment and well-being is not your top priority, or when you show your kid that your kid's boundaries or preferences are not things that you respect. The other way that you can make withdrawals from a relationship is by asking your kid to do things that are uncomfortable for your kid. And this is common. This happens a lot in relationships, right? It's, it varies from pass the salt to pick up dry cleaning to move aside a little bit, or, can you use your earbuds instead of playing the music loudly? These things happen. This is how relationships work. We're considerate of one another. But when we are considerate toward another person, there's a little bit of a cost to it, and it needs to be replenished. And if we're always asking somebody else to be considerate of us, always, and we're not giving anything to them by way of care or respect, eventually we'll deplete the goodwill. We don't want to be there. And so our aim is to have as much goodwill in the relationship as possible. Once we have that, requests that we make are very likely to be met with agreement. Generally speaking, in order to have a high relational account balance, we want to get into the habits of making small relational deposits all the time throughout the day. And they're not difficult things, right? It's about taking a moment to say thank you to your kid when your kid did something great, or to give good, clear, honest, genuine praise, or to check in with your kid and see how something that was important for your kid went, right? Or standing close and speaking quietly rather than shouting from across the room. All these things that I imagine you've all heard before and think about and do, but it's important to keep top of mind. And I think it's really important that we develop habits of doing these things throughout the day whenever possible. You ask your kid to do something, your kid did the thing, put aside whatever you have in your hands, possibly your phone, and just say, thank you. That was really great. I really appreciate it. And then pick up your phone again, right? Because not doing it is just wasting a moment where you could have made a relational deposit. So you make relational deposits throughout the day, end up with a lot of goodwill. And then when you are thinking about a habit that you want to help your kid develop, step one, and by far the most important, is to get buy-in from your kid, or ideally to get alignment between what you think is an important goal and what your kid thinks is an important goal. So there are lots of habits that you might want to help your kid acquire. In fact, this might be a fun thing to do. If those of you who are feeling so inspired, if you want to put into the chat, this could be fun for us to see each other's, right? If you want to put into the chat, what's a habit that you'd like to help your kid acquire? Or what's a habit that you can think of that will help your kid reach a goal that your kid has? Right? So if you take a moment and think about what those things might be, what are habits you're trying to help your kid with? So in my case, I'll give you some examples. Like when my kid was really young, one thing that I wanted to get started is for him to help set the table when we're sitting down to eat, and for him to help clear the dishes. And then later on, when he was older, my first language is Hebrew, and I wanted him to know to speak and read and write Hebrew as well. And so we speak Hebrew all the time, so that's not an issue, but I wanted him to learn to read and write. And so I really wanted to help him establish a habit of practicing reading and writing, because unlike speaking, reading and writing is a very intentional thing, right? So that's a habit that needs to be developed intentionally. Brushing teeth well, right? Having the procedure down for brushing teeth. That was another example. For older kids, doing homework at a particular time is another example, right? So what are things that come to your mind when you're thinking about these things? And for each of those, I went through essentially this process, and I'll give you examples of how this worked. So essentially, in order to get a behavior to happen, you need to align on a goal. For example, you might say something like, super important that your teeth be healthy, otherwise it can be very painful, or you can't eat anything other than oatmeal or whatever it is. Or you might say, I know that you want to get into the varsity team, they have an academic average that's required, right? So this is something that you want to be achieving, right? Or you might say, I know you've been wanting to do a back handspring forever, and there is a class that can teach you this thing. To get to the class, we must have enough time to go, right? But can we agree on the goal here? It's a critical step, because if you just tell your kid, do this because, now you're using power, you're making a constant withdrawal, and eventually you're going to run into overdraft. We don't want that. Ideally, we want the kid participating cheerfully and willingly, right? So can we align on a goal? And if we align on a goal, or once we align on a goal, we want to also talk about, well, what's the way that we get to the goal? What's the behavior that we're trying to establish here that will lead us to reaching to the goal? And if we can align on a goal, and if we can align on the solution for reaching that goal, then we're good. That's the process in the abstract anyway. Okay, a little more specifics. In general, it's really unlikely that I'll participate willingly in something that makes no sense to me, that I don't understand why I'm doing it and what the goal is, and if it makes me feel bad, right? And conversely, it becomes very likely that I'll do something if I know that it's going to lead to good things for me and it feels good to do it, right? So if I'm trying to get my kid to learn to read and write in another language than his primary language, if I force it, if I do it without any kind of positive experience for my kid in the process, if it doesn't connect to any goal that he has at all, and I just do it because I want to and for no other reason, it'll be very hard. If my kid says, oh, I want to travel to this area, I want to be able to speak to this group of people, I want to be able to read this particular book, whatever it is, it becomes much more likely. And if I make the experience easy and pleasant, it becomes that much more likely that it'll happen, right? And the same can apply even for clearing dishes from the table, to taking the dog for a walk, to sitting down to do homework, right? We want to structure it in a way that becomes sensible and pleasant. I'm going into more specifics in a second. This is not all science fiction. So here's a good way to fail at building a new habit. If you make the change really abrupt, if you make the behavior very frustrating and unpleasant, and if the whole thing generally feels unpleasant, the habit is probably not going to stick. If we want to succeed, we want to do basically the opposite. We want to make this change very slow. We want the kid to feel successful all the time, or nearly all the time. The activity ideally is pleasant, and the kid is well aware or can be easily reminded how this behavior is going to help the kid achieve a goal that the kid has that's important for the kid. So remember what I was saying earlier, that the first step is the most important thing. Let's say we're trying to develop a habit of doing homework, coming back from school. Maybe come back from school, and let's say we agree, we discussed it with the kid, and we have some agreement about why this is important, but there's maybe 30 minutes worth of homework, and homework is hard and frustrating. When is the best time to do it? Maybe we discuss it and we agree that the best time to do it is coming home. There's 15 minutes to relax, or 30 minutes to relax, whatever you agree, right? And then there's maybe snack, and then there's going to be homework time. And maybe you start with saying, success for me as your parent, I would consider this successful if you just sit down and do homework for 1 minute. Do you think you can do this? I mean this literally, for 1 minute, so that your kid then comes home, has the snack, rests a little bit, whatever, sits down, does 1 minute of homework, at the end of which you say, stop now, do not continue, right? This is amazing. You've succeeded. And the next day the same, and the next day the same. And a week later, your kid has a habit of coming home, putting the backpack aside, having a snack, and sitting down to do homework. And then you can start slowly increasing the time. But that first step is critical. And what you want to avoid the most when you're starting a new habit is eliciting any kind of resistance in your child, saying, this is too much. I cannot do this. This is a lot. Right? You don't want that. You want, when you're suggesting a change in behavior, ideally, you want your kid's response to be, yeah, I can do this. That's no problem. So how do we make it relevant for your kid? It starts with a conversation, consulting with your child, right? Figuring out what the goal is, either your goal or your child's goal, and how your goal is relevant for your child, if it's just your goal, right? I would like your help with clearing the dinner table, because then it gives me more time and energy, and I'm helping you with a lot of stuff, right? And I want to be able to do more of the things that are more interesting for you, like reading together at night, or like going to the hockey practice, or whatever it is that you're doing, right? But it would help me have more time and energy if you help me with this thing. So making those connections with the kid, discussing why it's important to behave in this way, or to work toward this goal. Ideally, we make it pleasant for your kid. Some behaviors are not inherently pleasant. Some activities are not inherently pleasant, or they are for some people and not for others. I could never get into running. It's just consistently unpleasant for me. But I hear that for some people, it's super fun, inexplicably for me. But you can make things more pleasant, either by adding things during the experience, right? You can listen to some podcast you like when you're running, or by giving a lot of praise and maybe reward when your child behaves in the way that you've agreed. And this reward is part of the agreement in the beginning, right? Saying, how would you feel about us spending 2 minutes practicing reading after you come back home from school? 2 minutes sounds like a lot, he said when he was 5. It's like, okay, how about 1 minute? He said, yeah, I can do 1 minute. I said, great, let's do 1 minute. And if we can do it 5 times in a row, actually, that's not what we did. We said, eventually, if you can read 20 words, that was like a long-term goal. If you can read 20 words, then you get this prize. And we had something we were working toward. But I praised a lot when he did 1 minute of reading. I praised for every single word. I threw a big party, right? Because the first step is the most important, right? Just sitting down to read, getting over that resistance is super important. And it's also the hardest for somebody who hasn't done this before, right? If you've never exercised or you haven't in a long time, just putting on the shoes and going out and running 10 yards, it's intimidating. And we want to take away as much of that resistance as possible internally for the child, maybe for us as well, right? So reward is fine, praise is very good, and do a lot more of it early on when they're just getting into the habit, because we want the experience to be as pleasant as possible. We want to set it up so that the kid is feeling successful. It might require some effort on the kid's part. Different kids are different in how much challenge they enjoy, right? We want to find that motivational sweet spot where it's challenging enough to be interesting, but not so challenging as to be frustrating. And for different kids, again, you know your kids, and so you figure out where it needs to be. But by and large, when you're starting something, your kid needs to feel or say, yeah, if I just try, I'm going to succeed. If I don't try, I won't succeed. But if I just try, I'll succeed. Very much like stepping on the first rung of the ladder, right? So you pick a goal that your kid is really convinced is really within reach, and then you cut it in half. So your kid is like, what? I can do this without barely even trying. You say, great, let's start that. Because what you're aiming for is just consistently having the kid do the first step in the habit at a particular time, right? Touch the leash, sit down to do a minute of homework, clear one plate, whatever it is. Your kid says, that's it. I can clear one plate, no problem. I thought you wanted the whole table. You're like, well, we'll see about the whole table. But for now, one plate, you'll be the super child. You'll be the child, the family's most valuable child if you do this. So we want to start easy. If that first rung is spaced 10 feet up, right? Imagine this is some enormous environmental sculpture, right? And your kid needs to get like a running start and then leap to reach for the, it's not going to happen. Your kid's never going to try. You set it at a really reasonable, normal distance. Your kid can just go like this and up. This will happen, right? The first step has to be easy. And similarly, once you start increasing the requirement, right? You cleared one plate, great. We've been doing this for a week, great. How about you clear 2 plates as opposed to let's jump to the whole table, right? For the same exact reason. We don't want the rungs to be spaced 10 feet apart. Every time it should be, oh yeah, I can do that easily, right? That's the goal, to never elicit resistance, to just have a sense that this is easy. Again, for different kids, different things will feel easy. Maybe your kid, after trying clearing one plate, will say, oh yeah, this is easy. I can do the whole table, no problem. And you might say, sure, let's try it, right? Sometimes this comes from the kids. So they'll tell you what kind of gap they're comfortable with, but careful not to over challenge them if they experience some success. It's a very common, for me, it's a big temptation often, and I need to watch it, right? That if my kid experiences success, I really want to give him a lot more challenge. It's unwise to do it because then that creates frustration and losing motivation. Sometimes I'll couch it playfully and I'll say, do you want to try something a lot harder? And we'll see if it works. And he says, yeah. And then I give into the temptation and then we do the thing. And then if it works, wonderful. And if it doesn't, I say, yeah, that was kind of a lot. How about this? Right. And I kind of rein it back in. All right. When establishing new habits, the first thing to focus on is doing the habit consistently, right? Forming an actual habit. If the habit is getting up, going to the bathroom, brushing teeth, and getting ready in this order, right? We just want to make sure that this order is correct. And I would worry less about the quality of the brushing or whatever. If we want to get into the habit of starting homework, half hour after coming back home from school, the thing I care about most is starting homework half hour after getting home from school every day. I don't care about the quality of the homework. Again, I say this literally, and I realize this is potentially a little counterintuitive for some people, but I don't care about the quality initially. I just want them doing it, right? I want them getting to school every day, right? That's the most important thing. So initiating the habit in the same because of the same situation, because of the same trigger situation, right? Initiating the habit every time consistently when the condition is met. That's the most important thing. And once that's established and once it's really locked in, then we start working on the quality of the work and make sure. So let's say if we're talking about doing homework, half hour after coming back home from school. So we come back home from school. Maybe the first step is starting a timer for 30 minutes, right? And if that's done consistently, then after 30-minute timer goes off and we sit down, we do a minute of homework. I don't even care what happened during that minute. As long as the kid is focused on homework, we're doing great. And then once that happens consistently, 2, 3, 4 days of this have been happening. Now I'm going to say, okay, let's see how this first reading comprehension problem that you're doing is going. And then I'll help the child put more effort into that 1 minute, but I'm not going to increase the minute. I'm going to say, let's see if we can really focus on this and do good work. Read slowly, read it out loud. Tell me what connects to what in this paragraph or whatever they work on in reading comprehension. And once we have one quality minute that happens consistently, then I'll increase it to 2 quality minutes that happen consistently. Or maybe the kid will be ready to jump to 5 minutes, but I don't want to jump too much, right? So consistency of initiation, the most important thing by far. Then the quality of the work. And after that, start increasing the quality while increasing the quantity while maintaining the quality. Okay, some general tips. One is the whole thing, in order to have alignment, you need to have explicit agreement with your kid about this. For most things, there's an exception with very, very young kids when you're just establishing routines. We were talking before we started the session, Bev and Charlene and I, about routines as opposed to habits. And when you're setting up routines for kids, this doesn't have to be with an explicit agreement, right? But once kids are older and you're introducing a new idea, you want to have a conversation about this. And the best time to have the conversation is basically when everybody's feeling fine, nobody's having a big emotion, nobody's upset about anything, nobody's like super engrossed in something very fun that they're doing and you're ripping them away from it. Just set a good time to talk about it when they're calm, focused, and you can actually have a conversation about it and agree on the goal and agree on the way to get there and agree on the very first step that they feel would be very easy for them, like doing it for a minute and so on. So time the conversation, align during that conversation on the goal and the reason for doing whatever behavior change you're aiming for here. And then pick a very specific trigger, a condition that makes the behavior start. When this, then that, right? You wake up, you go to the bathroom, and after you go to the bathroom in the morning, you brush your teeth. You come back home, you set a timer for 30 minutes and you start homework. Or maybe you don't set a timer, but 30 minutes after you sit down to do homework. Your baby sister eats one of your Legos. That's more of a medical emergency, I think. But your baby sister destroys one of your toys. As soon as this happens, you take 2 steps back and put your hands on your chest, right? Whatever is the habit you're trying to develop, pick a clear trigger, and if then. It could be when we get somewhere. It could be when this time shows on the clock or the alarm goes off, or it could be when this thing happens, right? Any of those, but a clear trigger to start the behavior. When you're picking goals, I strongly, strongly recommend goals that are under your control. For example, the amount of time that you perform a behavior, right? Because you can't really control the results. You can't say every day you need to get 10 math problems right within a minute. Like it's just might not be possible for your kid on a certain day or in general, right? But your kid can control how much time your kid is putting into it, right? And so the amount of time you're putting into something, the number of times you do something is also something that you can control, right? So these are great goals. Result goals are problematic because you can't control them. It's just easier to fail. And when you pick those goals that are under your control, your kid's control, start very low, like I mentioned before. And lastly, track the behavior. Tracking has this outsized effect on consistency. It's shocking how it works, including for grown-ups. If there's any habit you're trying to do, if you put a table on the wall and you give yourself gold stickers, or you just write a check mark, right? We want to keep it going. We want to keep success going innately. And so if you are able to say, your kid should take the dog out for a walk every evening, you just put a little table someplace where it's visible to you and your kid. Whenever your kid takes the dog on a walk, you just put a check mark. And soon enough, it starts filling up with check marks, and everybody wants to keep it going. And if the check marks start falling off, you can figure out what happened, and maybe you need to make it easier to do it. Right? But tracking is an inherent part of establishing a new goal. And so very often, one way to do it is for the last step of the behavior to be tracking. Your kid comes back from walking the dog and puts a check on the table. Your kid finishes 1 minute of homework and puts a check on the table. Right? Whatever it is, your kid cleared the dishes, puts a check on the table, or you put a check on the table just to be able to see it. Okay, so these are some general tips for this process. And then the last thing is, of course, troubleshooting, because it's not going to work perfectly, right? Sometimes the kid won't do the thing that you agreed, or sometimes circumstances change, or there's a holiday and things change. The main point is ignore the past, always, in terms of establishing a new habit. So if the habit is walk the dog every day, and your kid missed yesterday for some reason, your kid doesn't need to walk the dog twice today or for twice as long. Your kid didn't do homework yesterday for a minute. You should not be asking your kid to do homework for 2 minutes today to compensate, right? Because that increases resistance. It makes your kid less likely to do it. And pretty soon your kid ends up with a debt of 510 minutes of homework per day, and it's not going to happen. And so just ignore yesterday. If you slipped, just get back on the wagon, start over. The goal is today. If you see that too many misses are happening, then it's worth asking, what's the block here? Something's not working. Maybe half an hour after coming back home is not the right time to do it. Maybe the room is too noisy to do homework in. Maybe your kid is so afraid of homework that it requires a conversation, maybe something else, right? But so if a lot of misses are happening, it means the method needs to change, not that more force needs to be applied, because we want it to be easy. It just means that the rungs were a lot farther apart than we thought, and we need to find an even closer rung. And then in terms of breaking bad habits, which may or may not come up when we talk now, but sometimes does. Breaking bad habits is a little different than creating new and good habits. It's very hard to unlearn things, just like it's hard to not do things in general, right? Don't shout. Don't push your brother. Don't, whatever it is. It's hard to not do things, just like it's hard to not think about things. The way to go about it is to teach habits that block this negative behavior that we're trying to get rid of. Like the example I was giving before of, if your baby sister broke a toy that you have, put your hands on your chest and take 2 steps back. That will probably prevent inter-sibling smacking, right? At least for a minute, right? Or maybe do this and shout dad or shout mom, right? That has a chance of preventing some violence. So teaching habits that block and pinning them so the trigger is the event that normally would start the other behavior, or ideally an event that's a little bit earlier in time, is a good way to short circuit negative behaviors. I think that's it. So to summarize, new habits work when they're introduced slowly, when the kid feels successful doing them immediately, when they're relevant to the kid and to the kid's own goals, and when they feel pleasant to do, ideally, or at least less unpleasant. Very important to have a clear trigger to start the new behavior. Very important to focus on consistency of executing the behavior, of starting the behavior when that trigger happens. And it's great to track. Makes it easier to do the behavior, makes it easier to remain consistent. All right, that's the end of this. I'm going to stop the share in a second, but I do want to say, if any of you are interested in more of this stuff, you're welcome to go to parentingforhumans.com. For those of you feeling like it's too much typing, you can scan the QR code, and there you can find the mailing list with announcements about workshops like this and others, Instagram accounts, some videos with examples and ideas, and also drafts of chapters of forthcoming book, which I'd love some feedback on as well. So that's all at parentingforhumans.com.